Well, it's in the frequency range where speech occurs. And that's the frequency band that we're sensitive to because we have to be to understand each other. You know, it's kind of, you know, chicken and the egg, I guess, whether we adapted our speech to how we hear or our hearing is adapted to how our speech is produced. But it's in that frequency band where you have consonants and a lot of information is in that band. That's just why it's so distracting. So since we're dealing with impulsive sound, it's very important to consider the psychological factors that affect the noise impact in addition to simply the loudness or what you might measure with an A-weighted average sound pressure level, something like the equivalent continuous sound pressure level, LAEQ. In general, averaging techniques do not work well for impulsive sound, particularly highly impulsive sound, because the duration is so short. When you try to average, you spread that energy out over a long period of time, and it makes it look like it's a lot less than it is. So averaging techniques will underestimate the noise impact. And the process that we use is defined under ANSI standard at S12.9 is in part 4 of that series of standards. That's the American National Standards Institute is a publisher of that standard. And it is a quantitative assessment of annoyance caused by noise. It's based on listening tests, it's peer-reviewed studies of a jury of listeners exposed to different types of sound, different classifications. Could be impulsive sound, tonal sound, other sounds with special characteristics, which are not necessarily neutral, like traffic noise, for instance. That's kind of the baseline that we try to normalize to. The first one is the equivalent continuous sound pressure level. It's often abbreviated as LEQ. This is an average over the entire period of a measurement. It could be 2 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour, whatever is chosen. And so all that energy gets spread out over that period of time from these, brief impulses. And so quite often when this is done, it is not even possible to distinguish the sound from the pickleball courts from the background noise level, which is obviously not congruent with what is experienced by people on the site. Another one is Lmax. This is the maximum fast exponential time weighted sound pressure level. And what that means is that it is a running average of the sound pressure level with a relatively short time constant, 125 milliseconds. But as I said, you can see on the figure on the right, these impulses are often as short as 2 milliseconds. That's 2 orders of magnitude shorter than the averaging time of even this fast time weighting filter. So that is going to attenuate what you're trying to measure is basically the issues with this. Fast time weighting filter is a smoothing filter. That's what it's intended to do. It's intended to remove short transients in the signal so that you can get a smoother average of what is going on. So that's obviously problematic if you're trying to measure something that has a high peak pressure but a short duration. And also do not confuse Lmax with a peak sound pressure level. Peak sound pressure level is instantaneous. The Lmax is the maximum of an average over a period of time. And the last one is one that you don't see that often, but you do run into it sometimes in noise codes still. The percentile sound pressure levels are the level that's exceeded during a certain percentage of the measurement. For example, L10, as it's designated, is a level that gets exceeded 10% of the time of the measurement. L01 is the level that's exceeded during 1% of the measurement. So that's the percentile sound pressure levels are normally calculated from a fast exponential time weighted filter output. So they suffer from all the same shortcomings as L max, but there's also a few other issues, which I won't go into now. But yeah, and so here's just an example of using L max properly. This is a sound burst represented by the red curve. It starts at time equals 0. It rises immediately to its operating level at 1. It continues for a period of time, in this case 277 milliseconds, and then it shuts off and goes back to 0. The blue curve is the output of the fast exponential time averaging filter. And as you can see, it starts at 0, but it rises more gradually, and it reaches its peak value when the sound source shuts off, and then it decays. That maximum value that it reaches, in this case, is 1/2 dB below the true value of the signal, and it takes 277 milliseconds for the fast time weighting filter to reach that level of accuracy. That's about 2 time constants. Now, if you go to the next slide, this is what happens when you try to use Lmax with a pickleball paddle impact. Notice that the time scale is much shorter here. I had to do that for clarity. Whereas the previous slide was 0 to 1 second, this is 0 to 10 milliseconds. So it's 100 times shorter than the other case. So in this case, the signal rises to its steady state level and stays there for 2 milliseconds, then it cuts off. And after 2 milliseconds, the fast exponential time averaging filter output has only risen to a level that is 18 dB below the true level of the sound pressure. So that is a large measurement error. And unfortunately, it's unavoidable when using these types of metrics, which is why I recommend using the procedure in the ANSI standard, which is not an averaging technique. It's based on sound exposure level, looking at individual acoustical events so that you get a much more representative assessment of the noise impact that also takes into account psychological factors, where this also does not do that.
Very good. So your next slide says questions, and I know you have more slides after that. Did you want me to go through some of those other slides or stop here for a minute?
Well, we can take questions. I know we want to get to those.
Okay.
I have a question. Lance, so I mean, is it correct to say that that the standards haven't caught up with what we're actually hearing? You know, like people are telling us it's not that loud, but we actually hear it 350 feet away, 500 feet away. You know, I think there's a disconnect.
The noise regulation typically lags at least 30 to 40 years behind what we actually know about assessing noise.
Wow.
I mean, that's kind of where we're at now. And that's the real issue. It's more an issue that they have just never been implemented. Everyone kind of seems to want to do things the old way, and that's fine if you're measuring a roadway, but it does not work well for impulsive sound.
Okay, so are you going to get into in your presentation, Lance, about how sound travels in terms of height? Because that's one of the things we're battling here. Is I live across from the now infamous Walter Reed courts, and in Arlington, and by the way, I'm a pickleball player, so I really want to solve this. But what they want to do is just put a 10-foot wrap in, and we have 2-story houses, and we're terrified that it could potentially even increase the sound. Are you going to talk a little bit about how that travels?
Well, sure, I can talk about that. And how far away are the homes?
So my house is about 175, 200 feet, but we've got houses as close as 79 feet, and it's 6 courts, and it's
Okay.
pretty nonstop.
Setbacks can be a little tricky. They have to be a little fluid because they depend on other factors besides just distance. Elevation differences are really critical. In order for a noise barrier to be effective, it has to be able to block the line of sight from the players on the pickleball court to whatever noise sensitive location you have. If that's a second floor balcony or bedroom window, and you can look over the fence and see the players on the pickleball courts, then a fence cover is not going to be effective in that situation. The barrier has to be high enough to block the line of sight. So that's an issue where you really have to pay attention to the geometry of the site that you're on and make sure that those sight lines work out so that it's possible to build a noise barrier that's high enough to block that line of sight and actually give you adequate shielding